William Hyatt was a 62-year-old miner. His car broke down in the Mojave Desert. He walked for 22 miles across the searing sand, actually crawled the last 2 of those miles, and he died face down in the sand just over the hill, not more than a half mile away, was Saratoga Springs. He almost made it. A soldier called home at the end of World War II from Europe. He had been there for 4 years. He had survived horrific battles. He was there at the end. He called his mother and he said, "I'm coming home." He got on an Army transport, flew to the United States, got on a smaller plane bound for Dallas. Tragically, it crashed. He almost made it home. February the 1st, 2003, Space Shuttle Challenger, after 16 days in space, was 16 minutes from landing in Houston. Family members had gathered to welcome the 7 astronauts home. A piece of foam broke off, damaged a wing. The heat and force of re-entry caused that wing to break off, and the Challenger broke in pieces and scattered itself across Louisiana and Texas. They almost made it home. Agrippa stood before Paul. Paul was a compelling speaker, mercurius. He was compared to Mercurius. The gospel was a compelling message, and Agrippa believed it. "Believest thou the prophets? I know thou believest," Paul said. But Agrippa said at the end of that message, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." He walks off the stage of Scripture and of history, and he never was closer to making it to heaven than that day he heard Paul preach. Almost does not avail. Almost is but to fail. Since the soul is our most precious, prized possession, worth more than all the world, Matthew 16:26, the loss of the soul is life's greatest tragedy. Jesus took a nail-scarred hand, pointed it at a world for which he had just died, and a composite of what he said was, "Go into all the world, to all the nations, to every creature, to the ends of the earth, to the end of time." Matthew 28:19, Mark 16:15, Romans 10:18, "And tell them what I've done for them." Preach the gospel. The average Christian will listen to, or has listened to, about 6,000 sermons so far, has been led in prayer 1,000 times, has sung about 20,000 songs, sometimes over and over, and has not yet led one person to the Lord. I know that I do not speak to average Christians in this assembly this afternoon, but I suppose all of us are compelled to want to bring more people to Christ. We want to do it better. We want to see more souls around us on the other side in that golden city of light. There are 2 things required for that. One, motivation. We have to get up out of our easy chairs, off of the golf course or basketball court, or in front of the PlayStation, or whatever it is that we enjoy doing, and go out and find people who are lost and talk to them. Motivation to do what the Lord told us to do in His last breath on earth. The other thing is instruction, how to do it better. When we go out and talk to people, we can have what we say makes a difference. How we approach them can make a difference of whether they are receiving of the gospel or rejecting of the truth. And as we see the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, he was converted, as far as I can tell, in AD 34 at 31 years of age. From that point on, he was in a dead run for heaven. For 30 years, he never seems to me to have let up. He traveled 12,000 miles by land and sea. He evangelized 50 cities on 3 continents. He established, as far as I can tell, 75 congregations. He wrote 14 books of the Bible. That is about 52% of the New Testament. And he wrote 100 chapters of the 260 chapters in the New Testament. And yet Paul was not always successful. He led many to Christ. Others, like Agrippa in Acts chapter 26, said no to the offer that Paul made to him with the gospel. And this afternoon, I hope this will be motivational to us as we think about reaching out. But I also hope it will be instructional to us as we think about doing it better. Maybe we can hit the middle between those two goals as we study here in Acts chapter 26, the time when Paul preached unto kings as Jesus had said he would do. Acts 9:15, when he called him from the world of darkness into the kingdom of heaven. Now let's go to Acts 26 and let's think about our evangelism and Paul's evangelism and the hindrances to reaching lost souls in his generation, which are the same as the hindrances to souls coming to Christ in our generation. You know, the devil has no new tricks. He's used them enough to become very proficient, but he has the same things to do today that he had back then. And as we think about Paul, now he's been in prison for 2 years at this time, after Felix was replaced by Festus, willing to show the Jews a pleasure. He left him bound for 2 years. And this is the quietest 2 years of Paul's ministry as far as we can tell. He did not write any books during this period, if we're dating the books correctly. He did not preach any sermons after the one that we read that he had preached earlier to Felix until this opportunity. And so Paul, I'm sure he was talking to his guards and whoever it was that he would have an opportunity to talk to wouldn't have a record of it. But here he was sitting in his jail cell one day, and the guard came and said, "Tomorrow, Agrippa wants to hear you." Now that would not have pleased most Christians who heard that a Herod wanted to speak to them. I mean, it was this man's great-grandfather who killed the babies when Jesus was born, Matthew chapter 2. It was this man's great-uncle before whom Jesus was brought at the time of the crucifixion. It was this man's father, here at Agrippa I, who killed James and put Peter in prison, and because he did not give the glory to God, was eaten of worms and he died, Acts chapter 12. And now, Herod Agrippa II was 17 years old when that happened. He was, history says, away in Rome, being trained in the court of the emperor. And the emperor, Claudius, really liked him, wanted to give him his father's kingdom at that point, but his advisors advised him against it, and so he waited till he was 23. At this point, his kingdom has expanded again to, it's probably about AD 55 here. And he has been given, among other things, authority over the temple in Jerusalem, so that he has control over the treasury, and also he can appoint and disappoint the high priest. And he did that 7 times during his reign and made the Jews furious and they didn't like him. But he was a man who knew something about the law because of that responsibility. Also, because he was an Idumean, had grown up in and around Judaism. His mother seems to have been a practicing Jew. She may have left him impressions and maybe teaching about Judaism. So Paul, when he begins his message before Agrippa, comments on that. He knew him to be an expert in matters of the law. He's happy to talk to him. Now, as you picture that scene, if you can, I suppose that they have allowed Paul to shave and to clean up some, put on new clothes, but he still has his bonds or his chains, as he'll mention in chapter 26. And he comes out, but he's not the first one. First, in the great assembly hall, can you picture Governor Festus who comes out? This is his jurisdiction. Agrippa is visiting him, sort of a courtesy call because he has recently come into power. And so here is the governor dressed, no doubt, in his finest. Here is the king, Agrippa, perhaps wearing his crown. Bernice at his side, no doubt dressed to the nines. They come and find their place at the head of that great assembly. The centurions were there, probably would have been 5 centurions stationed at Caesarea at this time. The powerful men of the city were there. So there's a crowd of people, and then they bring out Paul. And here he marches out, stands before this august group, and instead of pleading for his own innocence, which was true, he pleads instead for the souls of those who were his judges. Instead of showing any self-interest at all, he puts his head, as it were, on the chopping block, and he is ready to speak to these who had power to dismiss or power to execute him, and he is not afraid to offend them by saying to them that they need to be Christians. And he persuasively, powerfully preaches the gospel. And as we've already seen at the end of the day, Agrippa walks off the stage not being a Christian, but why? That's our question. And when you sit down and study with someone at your kitchen table or in their living room or at your office at the church building, and you go through your maybe 3 lessons, 5 lessons, whatever approach it is that you go through, and you get to the end and you've covered all the things they need to know, and they say, well, thank you for your time. I'll think about it. Maybe later. I don't know. Why do people do that? When they are at the very door of the kingdom and all the attendant blessings, why do they walk away? Well, there are some reasons that we see right here with Agrippa. Let's think about them. If you can picture that scene before you, that's where we'll start. Here's Agrippa listening to Paul preach, and as Paul is preaching the gospel, including its moral dimensions, as he had earlier preached to Felix, judgment, the judgment to come, temperance and righteousness. Perhaps, let's say to the right of Agrippa on that stage that day was Festus. And if Agrippa is almost persuaded that day, it might have been Festus that was the tipping point in the wrong direction. Because although Agrippa was a king and Festus was a governor, Festus was older. In fact, he'll be dead in about 2 years. And so Agrippa's only 30 years old at this point. He's relatively new in power. He would want to ingratiate himself with a man who would have some say in how successful he would be because they were ruling in joint jurisdictions. And Festus has already tipped his hand about what he believes about Paul. In fact, one of the interesting things about the book of Acts is found over in chapter 25 and verse 19. This is one of the benefits of inspiration and the evidences of inspiration, because we have in this section a behind-the-scenes look at a conversation that took place between 2 Roman officials that was private. Festus is talking to Agrippa when Agrippa comes to see him, and he says, there's a man that was left here from Felix, and when I went to Jerusalem, his enemies wanted him sent back down there so they could try him there. And I said no, and that made them come here. They came here, and they did not say anything that I thought would be what the accusations were, but it was things related to their religion. Now watch how he expresses that in 25:19, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition. How does Festus view religion? It's just a bunch of superstition. And what does he think about the resurrection? Well, you continue reading, and of one Jesus which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Now, think about that for a minute. That's what he thinks in his heart of hearts in a private moment behind the scenes, he's showing Agrippa what he thinks about this one who's left for him to deal with from Felix. And the reason he's in prison is because he made the Jews mad, because he said Jesus was alive and they said he's dead. And he's appealed to Caesar because willing to show the Jews a pleasure, Festus said, "Would you like to go to Jerusalem and be tried there?" Well, Paul knew that they intended to kill him. And he, as a Roman citizen, had the right to appeal to Caesar, and so he does. And that sets in motion a chain of events that ultimately led him to Rome. And Festus says to Agrippa, I can't send him without sending some charges of what the Caesar is supposed to decide he's guilty of or innocent of. And I can't just put down superstition. I can't just put down, he says Jesus is alive. It doesn't violate any Roman law. And so he's asking Agrippa if he would be interested in helping him come up with that accusation. And Agrippa says, "I'll hear him tomorrow." Now, here, but before we ever bring Paul out, and unbeknownst to Paul, this man has already shown that he believes what Paul is preaching is not true. It's superstition. Now, as Paul is powerfully making his points, and if the King James is correct, and it seems to me the evidence from the context is that he was almost persuaded to be a Christian, not just with a few words, "Fain wouldest thou make me a Christian." Either way, it comes out to be the same, but it seems to me from Paul's reaction that he took his words at face value, and so he's nodding his head, and you can see as Paul is preaching. And then he glances over, and Festus has a scowl on his face. He is biting his lip to keep from interrupting Paul, and eventually he does interrupt him. You see in chapter 26, and it's at that same point of the resurrection. When Paul gets to the resurrection, Festus has had all that he can take. And he says in verse 24, "And as he thus spake for himself, Festus said with a loud voice, 'Paul, thou art beside thyself.'" We would say, "Paul, you are insane." The word here is a word from which we get mania or maniac. "Much learning hath made thee mad." Well, Festus was a former soldier. He was not a man of books. And he tips his hand again about what he thinks about education here. He said, not only is this man insane, but I can even diagnose what the reason for the insanity is he's read too many books. He has gone to too many classes. I tell you, this man is insane because he's learned too much. Paul, listening to that, does not spend much time correcting that error. He simply says, in answer to it, he's focused on Agrippa. In fact, if you read through this 5 times, he addresses the king personally in this speech. Now, there are a lot of other people there that day, including Festus and Bernice, but he is focused on the one he's most likely to be able to win, and that's Agrippa. And we have to do triage sometimes when we go to a situation. Which one in the family or which one among a group is most likely to become a Christian? Which one is it that I have the most likelihood? I'll start there. They may reject the gospel. I'll move on to someone else. But that's what Paul does here, and he's focused on Agrippa. But he does answer Festus. He's speaking words of reason. He's not speaking words that... In other words, what I'm saying doesn't sound like an insane man. I'm speaking forth words of truth and soberness. And then he goes back to talking to the king in 26. But I said all that to get back to this point. Why does Agrippa say no? Because it might have been the influence of other people. You know why some people don't become Christians today? It's not because you didn't use the right word or the right method of Bible study. It's not because they did not like the service of the church that they visited that day or the sermon topic that happened to be being presented. It's that they are concerned about what their friends are going to say about them if they become Christians. What will the people at work say when I go back and I say, "You know what I did yesterday? I become a part of the Church of Christ." "You did what?" What will my parents say if I obey the gospel and they are in a denominational religion? we've had it happen twice in Jacksonville in the years that I've preached there. We have a college ministry. Jacksonville State University's really all around our building. It's a great opportunity. And we are able to lead a number of people from during that stage of life to the Lord. And 2 of them over the years have been kicked out of their families for becoming a part of the church. One young man, this is a number of years ago, and later I preached a meeting in another city. I had lost contact with him. And guess who led the singing in that gospel meeting? But that young man whose dad put his clothes in a suitcase on the porch and said, "Don't come back in this house." Another young lady, her family said, we're not going to pay for your college anymore. And they didn't. The elders bought her a vehicle to drive. She got a job. She made it through college. What are my parents going to say if I obey the gospel? What are my friends going to say? In John 12:42 and 43, some among the chief rulers believed in him, but they would not confess him for fear of the Pharisees, lest they be cast out of the synagogue, for they love the praise of men more than the praises of God. James 4:4, if we are friends of the world, we make ourselves the enemy of God. In John 5:44, how can you believe which receive honor one another? When Harry Ironside was a boy, his mother talked to him about becoming a Christian. He was reluctant, and she talked to him again. And finally, he said, "My friends are going to laugh at me if I become a Christian." And his mother looked him in the eye and said, "Your friends can laugh you into hell, but they will never laugh you out of hell." You know? The friend, if Festus is the reason that Agrippa did not make the right decision that day, he was not a real friend, was he? But then again, we see a second reason that Agrippa may not have obeyed the gospel that day. On the other side, if we picture Bernice on the other side, he and she had one of the most scandalous relationships in all of ancient history. She was by no means a virtuous woman. This is vouched by both, recorded by both Josephus in Jewish history and also Tacitus in Roman history. She married at 13 her own uncle. When he died, she moved in with her brother, Agrippa, and they did not live together as brother and sister, but as husband and wife. To tamp down rumors, a marriage was arranged with the king of Sicily, Polemo, but it didn't last very long. And then she would come back to Agrippa. Every time in the book of Acts that they're mentioned, there were 3 times they're always mentioned together. Later, she would leave him and be mistress to Vespasian and Vespasian's son, who was 10 years her junior, Titus, who was the same general that sacked eventually Jerusalem. So here you have Bernice, who is on the stage that day with Agrippa, and maybe as Paul is reasoning about the gospel, he ventures a look over at her and thinks, if I become a Christian, I'm going to have to give up this pleasure. Agrippa's not the last one that allowed sin to keep him from becoming a Christian, is he? 2 Timothy 4:3, some love sin more than they love God. And that day he chose to remain with her and turn his back on an opportunity to live forever in a place where there are pleasures forevermore. Psalm 16:11. We see again, though, that day, another person who might represent the reason that Agrippa did not obey the gospel. And that's Paul himself, who's standing before him. For as he looks at Paul, he sees the cost of discipleship. Luke 9:23, Jesus said, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up the cross, and follow me." Well, Paul had done that. And he was wearing the chains that brought about. He had on his body, I don't know how much of his body was exposed in the robes or whatever it was that he was wearing that day. But he talks about receiving 195 stripes. 2 Corinthians 11:24. 5 times 40 less 1 stripe each time. What did his back look like? Or his neck, or his face, or his arms, or his legs? Where did they hit him? He was stoned and left for dead. Did that leave any marks? Any damaged muscles, tendons, bones that didn't heal back exactly like they originally were? He says in Galatians 6:17, I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Another occasion he talks about some who would have plucked out their eyes and given to him if it had been possible to do so. Many scholars believing that indicates Paul had some difficulty seeing. Maybe one of those rocks hit him in the eye, you think? Or maybe it's just as he aged. Whatever it was, when Agrippa looked at Paul, he must have thought, do I really want to be a part of Christianity if this is the cost? There was a time in our country when it was an honorable thing to be a Christian. People were ashamed if they did not, quote, go to church on Sunday. I mean, if you asked somebody you work with or went to school with, what religion are you or where do you attend church services, they might not attend, but they would be ashamed not to give some answer, the one they grew up in or the one their grandparents attended. But it's not that way anymore, is it? The tables are turning, especially those 40 and under, where religion's the problem, that's not the solution in their minds. They're not so sure they really want to be identified with Christianity, even in the general sense as they might see it, but especially not in the New Testament sense. The cost of discipleship. Think about, thankfully, the gospel is powerful enough to overcome even culture, isn't it? I was thinking, sitting here before I got up here about this point, the last 4 that we've baptized in Jacksonville, 3 of them are 21 and under, 25 and under for sure. The one that I baptized last week, in his 30s, sincere, didn't grow up in the church, had trouble with drugs and alcohol, in jail at times. But he's doing right now. He's been doing right for a while. He's been attending, and he wants to be a Christian. He texted me a few minutes ago. And he said, in text before this is the best thing I have done since I got sober. The gospel's powerful. It can overcome evil influence. It can overcome the love of pleasure. It can even overcome the cost of discipleship. But then again, there may be another reason that Agrippa did not become a Christian. And I suppose this is the one that I would advance as the real reason. For not only was there Festus representing fear of man, and Bernice representing love of sin, and Paul representing cost of discipleship, but there also was Agrippa representing the folly of delay. It may be that when he said almost persuades thou to me to be a Christian, he was thinking in his mind, Paul, you have made some really good points today. I'm going to think about these. I'm going to act on them. I'm almost there, but give me a little more time. But just like Felix before him, when I have a convenient season, I'll call for you. You keep flipping the pages of Acts and you never read where Felix called Paul back. In fact, he's dead soon, isn't he? He's replaced by Festus. What about the Athenians? Acts 17:32, when Paul preached the resurrection from the dead, some mocked. Others said, we will hear thee again of this matter. And you keep reading the rest of the chapter 18, on down. Where do you ever read where they obey the gospel and they said, we will do it later? Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for no man knows what a day will bring forth. Proverbs 27:1. How long halt you between two opinions? If God be God, worship Him. If Baal be God, worship Him. 1 Kings 18:21. Choose you this day whom you will serve. Joshua 24:15. And as Agrippa was thinking about it, I wonder if he thought, I'm just too busy. Maybe when I'm not king anymore, or maybe when, things settle down. It used to be when you greeted someone in the marketplace or across the back fence, wherever, how are you doing? What answer how are things going? You would receive, fine. Or, you know what the most common answer I hear now when you ask, how are things? I'm busy. Some people are working 40, 50, 60 more hours a week. Kids have ball practice and ball games, 3, 4 nights a week, and on weekends there's travel ball. And the grass has to be mowed, and shopping has to be done, and there are vacations to plan, and there are spouses to love. And they would say something like, I really probably need to go to church services. But just the thought of adding something else to my to-do list is daunting. Henry David Thoreau said, it's not enough to be busy. The ants are busy. What are we busy about? Jesus was busy about His Father's business, Luke 2:49. And there will come a time when these things that we try to find happiness or fulfillment in, treasures and careers and relationships and sin, will be like gravel in the mouth of a thirsty man. There's cisterns that can hold no water, Jeremiah 2:13. And Isaiah asked the question, the pertinent question, why will you spend for that which satisfieth not? Isaiah 55:2. Hear me, saith the Lord. Maybe he thought, Agrippa, perhaps he thought, well, I have my reputation to uphold. When he entered the scene that day, it was with great pomp, the Bible says, showing a love for ostentation, perhaps hinting at his pride. And as Paul's standing there preaching that he should be a Christian, he's thinking, I would have to admit that I'm a sinner that needs a Savior. I don't want to say that in front of all these people. I have my pride. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 16:18. Whosoever shall humble himself as this little child, the same is great in the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 18:3. Luke 14:11, whosoever abaseth himself shall be exalted. The question is not will I bow to Jesus, but when. It will either be now, when I can receive the benefit of it, or it will be then, when it will be too late. Perhaps he was thinking, well, I would if someone else would go with me. I don't want to do it by myself. Sometimes people do that today. If my husband would go, I would go. If my wife would go with me, I would be there. If our children like to go, we would come. Truthfully, Christianity is best with all the family there and with all the friends. But somebody's got to go first. Matthew 10:37, whoso loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And the best thing that any person can do for his or her family or friends that he or she loves is to be a Christian. First and foremost, because that good example may lead them. Who knowest, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? 1 Corinthians, is that 10:16? It's in Corinthians. Just read the whole book. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I would go, but it could be this one. Sometimes someone will say, I'm too timid. I'm introverted. I'm reluctant. I'm afraid. Their urgent things call for action. If this building were on fire, would you be too timid to find a door? If the pathology report came back cancerous, would you be reluctant to arrange for treatment? If the letter came in the mail saying that you had inherited property and jewels from a family member, could you summon the courage to sign the papers in the lawyer's office? Those things are but trinkets to what we're talking about today. All the jewels and the gold and the whole earth will be burned up one day. But the soul that is you will live on. And no one ever has more support than when he responds to Christ. The angels rejoice around the throne of God, Luke 15:10. Those who are in the assembly will hardly be dry-eyed with joy over one who comes home. Oh, the prayers that have been prayed, the hopes that have been assigned to that decision in their hearts. You will have the support of heaven and earth if you come to Christ. And if Christ wants us to do something, isn't it possible? Or maybe I should say impossible, that it's impossible for us to do it. I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. Philippians 4:13. I'm going to close with an illustration I read. I think it sums up the urgency of not only responding to Christ, but to those of us who are the first responders to reach them, to bring them in, that we must not delay, that we must take every opportunity. A man had a sore come up on his finger, and he went to the doctor. The doctor examined it, took a sample from it, and sent it. And then he came back in the room, and he said, "Sir, I am sorry to tell you this, but you have a very serious infection in your finger, and it needs to be amputated. There is no cure for this." And the man was taken aback. And he said, "I just came in with a sore on my finger, and you're going to cut it off? I need a second opinion." And the doctor said, "Well, I respect that, but this needs to happen soon." Well, the man went home and he got a second opinion, same opinion. He came back to his first doctor the next week, and he said, "Okay, I've made up my mind. I need the surgery." And the doctor looked at his finger, and then he looked at his hand. He said, "It's spread. We're going to have to take your entire hand now." He said, "No. How am I going to earn a living for my family without my right hand? I've got to be able to think about it. I've got to be able to work." He said, "Well, you need to make a decision as soon as possible." And so he went home to sleep on it. Came back the next day. He and his wife were in agreement he needed to have the surgery. The doctor saw him. He looked at his hand. He said, "It's spread. We're going to have to take your arm." He said, "Oh, my right arm?" And he began to cry. He said, "I just can't decide." The doctor said, "Well, I'm going to make my rounds. When I finish, I'll come back and you can tell me." He did, and he came back. And he said, "I want you to do it." And so they prepped him and took him to the operating room. But they discovered it had entered his bloodstream. and he did not survive. One has to think, if he had gone when the doctor first said, the outcome might have been so different. And we have to think, as we look at this example from Acts 26, if Agrippa had just taken that step, things could have been so different. And yet almost does not avail. Almost is but to fail.